Jesuit Lecture is one of the many events that connect our institution with the wider community. And this annual series, hosted by the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies here at Campion College, draws on the expertise of scholars chosen by the Jesuit Fathers of Saskatchewan. The lecture explores major issues in contemporary Catholic thought that appeal to a diverse local audience. Its mandate is to be Catholic, accessible, and interesting. It's a very high bar. So this year we've invited Dr. Charles Camosy to present from his new book entitled Resisting a Throwaway Culture: How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. Charlie grew up in the cornfields of Wisconsin, but is now an associate professor of theology at Fordham Jesuit University in the Bronx, where he has taught since finishing his PhD at Notre Dame in 2008. Among other places, Dr. Camosy has published articles that have appeared in the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, the Journal of Catholic Health Association, the New York Times, the Washington Post, America Magazine, and so forth. His most recent book, again, Resisting Throwaway Culture, was published in May 2019. Aside from his academic pursuits, Dr. Camosy helps advise the Faith Outreach Office of the Humane Society and the Children's Hospital of New York. He received the Robert Burns Award from the Fordham Respect Life Club and received the 2018 St. Jerome Award for Scholarly Excellence from the Catholic Library Association. He has 4 children, 3 of whom he adopted with his wife Pauline from a Filipino orphanage in June 2016. So speaking about 50 minutes, which will follow with questions, it's my great honor to welcome to Campion College for the 2019 Jesuit Lecture, Dr. Charles Camosy.
How's the mic working? Can you hear me all right in the back? Can you hear me on the side, I guess? We have the side too. That's great to see. Good evening. I'm really happy to be here, genuinely super thrilled to be here, but before I say more about why I'm so happy to be here, I want to thank Father for all you did to make this happen, which I understand was quite a lot to make this first inaugural lecture happen. No pressure, first inaugural lecture. I want to make a second one, right? I want to make a second one. I also want to thank Brett for putting us together. Where's Brett? There. I want to make sure I thank Father more than Brett, though. So, Father, thank you more than Brett. But seriously, I've been overwhelmed I've been here since Monday afternoon, flying from New York through Toronto to Regina. And I've spoken at all 4 high schools, actually, today and yesterday, and that was a really wonderful experience. I even got to meet with certain members of the archdiocesan leadership teams, especially in the pro-life movements, which was great discussion last night. It was very educational. This is an absolutely vibrant Catholic community, if you didn't need to look around this packed house to see that. I'm so jealous, actually. This is a very, very vibrant and wonderful community. I hope to return at some point. Well, I hope you find my remarks substantial. I also hope you find them provocative enough to ask questions. So I'm going to leave selfishly, I'm going to leave lots and lots of time for question and answer. I've been told that I don't need to worry about that. There will be a lot of questions, but let me just say that out front. I really want to engage with you. Some may happen during question and answer, others may happen I guess there's a reception afterwards. We might be able to get something to eat and chat a little bit. That would be great too. So, I hear there's something happening here on Monday. Is that correct? In the U.S., you may know that we're in the autumn of the year before a presidential election, which means we are on the early stages of our nation's long, secular, liturgical season of anticipation, kind of like a bizarro world Advent. And especially given this national liturgical season of anticipation, if you consume any U.S. media, which I hear you may do, you may have a sense of just how badly things are going. Indeed, in U.S. American political culture, at least as we've come to know it over the previous 2 generations, is collapsing. Congress is now more polarized than at any time since Civil War Reconstruction and has an approval rating of 19%. Notably, when asked in a poll, U.S. Americans prefer cockroaches to Congress. True story, I'm not making that up. Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in 2016 with a solid electoral college victory, but lost the popular vote by more than 3 million, and came in with the lowest approval ratings in modern history. And polls now show that over half of U.S. Americans would like to see an impeachment inquiry go forward. Significantly, relatively few voters voted for Clinton or Trump in 2016, as if they were voting for a good candidate they wanted to support. Instead, they were voting against a terrible candidate they hated. For some time now, the general consensus has also been, to move to a different branch of government, that the Supreme Court, at least on major cultural issues, has abandoned its role as a nonpartisan interpreter of the law in favor of political warfare, poorly disguised with post hoc legal arguments. The general consensus could not have been more strongly confirmed by the circus that was the 2018 Senate confirmation hearings for now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. After all of this, there was good reason for Washington Post columnist Elizabeth Bruenig to wonder whether U.S. political culture is suffering from a near complete dissolution of the trust required for even a democratic republic to function. There is a deep and growing sense that the whole public thing is little more than a rigged game, rigged by a tiny few with power and privilege who have become skilled at disconnecting it from justice and the common good in favor of their own narrow set of interests and or those of their paymasters. Often it's the paymasters that they're working for. The polarization and disconnect of our national politics has a symbiotic relationship with the polarization and disconnect within the broader culture. Politics is downstream of culture. Living in a world dominated by technology like smartphones and social media, many find themselves increasingly disconnected from the physical, the embodied, the real, and especially from authentic encounters with the other. We'll come back to authentic encounter towards the end of the lecture. Couple this with the unprecedented ease of travel and mobility of the middle and upper classes, at least. We now know most people with the resources to do so live in actual and virtual communities, which think pretty much like they do. The news channels we watch, the websites we visit, the people we follow on social media, our physical neighbors, our actual and virtual friends, our churches, the people with whom we socialize. Most of us consume information and engage ideas in ideologically comfortable, largely disconnected communities that rarely force us to critically examine the received wisdom of our ideological community. Any of this sound familiar? If my discussion with folks from the diocese last night was any indication, I think much of it rings true here as well. Here's my thesis for tonight's lecture. My thesis is that a Roman Catholic critique of consumerist throwaway culture, one which stands strong within a consistent ethic of life offered by Cardinal Bernardine, St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, has the capacity to unite politically fractured people. What is this thing behind me called throwaway culture, though? Well, rather than begin with a straight-up definition, which the analytic philosopher in me wants to give you, just give you the definition, I think it might be helpful actually just begin with specific examples. For the first example, I'm going to begin with a phrase. See if you've heard it before. Here's the phrase: cardiac pole vibration. Have you ever heard that before? Cardiac pole vibration. It comes over the recent U.S. debate over bills in several states banning abortion after 6 or 7 weeks, referred to by many of their opponents as so-called heartbeat bills. The actress Alyssa Milano, who somehow has become a significant public voice on these and other matters, insisted that the media should not refer to a heartbeat, don't call it a heartbeat, but instead use another similarly awkward phrase, fetal pole cardiac activity. Now, you might just dismiss her as somebody who doesn't know anything about prenatal biology, but she got the phrase from an OBGYN named Jennifer Gutner, whose description was picked up by lots and lots of national US media. The science correspondent for Slate magazine who interviewed Dr. Gutner referred to it as a cluster of pulsating cells. Jennifer Kearns, an OBGYN at UC San Francisco and director of research in OBGYN at Zuckerberg San Francisco Hospital, said that it is, quote, a group of cells with electrical activity, end quote. These and other authorities in medicine seemed quite naturally to offer a definitive refutation of a manipulative term that pro-lifers would use, like heartbeat. But as a bioethicist, I know quite well, just how deeply politics, and especially abortion politics, there's no more toxic kind, has infected even the most basic discussions of medicine and biology. In point of fact, the primordial heart is a group of cells in the same sense that you and I are groups of cells. Open any embryology textbook, and they will tell you that at 6 weeks gestation, the human heart has 4 chambers and is pumping blood unidirectionally. Sounds like a heart to me. In fact, these very same people, apart from the debate over heartbeat bills, will tell pregnant patients at 6 or 7 weeks that their baby's heartbeat is so many beats per minute. And even make sure the parents can listen to the heartbeat. I have a 16-month-old at home. It's that first heartbeat is tattooed on my brain. Indeed, as many of you who have been close to a pregnancy at this stage know, the heartbeat is an incredibly important marker for the health of the prenatal child at this stage of her life. The kinds of rhetorical moves in the debate over the heartbeat bills is a classic example of what Pope Francis calls our throwaway culture, where even human beings are reduced to mere things, which can then be discarded as so much trash. Part of the dehumanization which takes place is the use of specific words or phrases for the unwanted, the inconvenient human beings, which makes them easier to discard. As the website Secular Pro-Life said, the embryonic heart is a bunch of pulsating cells. In the same exact way, the embryo herself is often described as a clump of cells. Use of the phrase in both contexts serve as rhetorical moves made to downplay the fact that this is a human being. Even using the term fetus rather than baby, I would argue, is an example of a dehumanization tactic. When the child is wanted, we talk about baby bumps, don't we? Baby showers. OBGYN will tell you that your baby is doing great. Again, I speak from personal experience. But when the topic is abortion, when the prenatal child is unwanted, suddenly the language shifts. And doctors and others talk about a fetus, or even the products of conception, or in extreme examples, even a parasite. This despite the fact that Dr. Christian Collier of the University of Michigan Medical School has demonstrated quite powerfully that mother and prenatal child cooperate with each other in pregnancy in deeply profound and even just unbelievably moving ways. I'm learning from her the most recent science on this, and it's just astonishing what we're learning about how deeply connected the mother and prenatal child are. I mean, we know obviously that there's a connection, but the ways in which they're connected, the way they create the placenta together, the only shared organ in the human race, the baby's cells literally stay inside her mother for the rest of the mother's life, and lots of other things we're learning that are just astonishing. You may have heard of National Public Radio in the US. Often radio stations and other media have guidance with regard to language use. Their official guidance says to avoid language suggesting that there is a baby inside the pregnant woman, not a fetus. Babies are not babies until they're born, they're fetuses. Incorrectly calling the fetus a baby or the unborn is part of the strategy used by anti-abortion groups. end quote. No, correctly calling the prenatal child a baby is resisting throwaway culture's tendency to inconsistently shift language to make undesirable human beings easier to throw away. I suppose one could try to be consistent in the other direction, but somehow I think phrases like fetus bump or fetus shower are going to have a hard time catching on. Pope Francis describes throwaway culture as a mentality in which everything has a price. Everything can be bought, everything is negotiable. This way of thinking has room only for a select few, while it discards all those who are unproductive. It reduces everything, including some people, into mere things with value that consist only in being bought, sold, used, and discarded when the consumerist determined value has been exhausted. Before I leave the issue of abortion and move on to other issues, I wanted to mention a Canadian story which I think fits perfectly, and I've been sharing with the high school students over the last couple of days, because it perfectly captures the Pope's understanding of throwaway culture. A few years ago, the National Post did a story on a couple that in British Columbia that had paid a surrogate mother to gestate their child. They donated the ova and sperm, and they paid a gestational mother to gestate the child. And they also had a contract with her for that. In the middle of the pregnancy, however, they found out that the child had Down syndrome. The parents apparently had a contract that said that they could request the surrogate to terminate the pregnancy if the baby had Down syndrome. The surrogate refused. She was already deeply connected to the child and had no intention of killing her. Canadian law at the time, and I didn't follow the story after that, so maybe some of you know how it was resolved, but Canadian law at the time didn't know what to do. Should contract law prevail, and should this woman be forced to execute the contract? Or should family law prevail, in which, of course, you would never force a woman to have an abortion she didn't want to have? A bioethicist, let's hear it for bioethics, was quoted in the National Post piece saying it shouldn't be contract law unless the human life is to be treated like, quote, widgets in the factory, end quote. Should the rules of commerce apply to the creation of children? No, because, quote, children get hurt. It's kind of like stopping the production line. Uh-oh, there's a flaw. It makes sense in a production scenario, but in reproduction, it's a lot more problematic, end quote. I don't even necessarily like the term reproduction because the word production is still in the word. It sends the signal of kind of consumerism and thingification, product. Maybe we could talk about procreation, I don't know. What a tragically accurate example of throwaway culture at work. Thinking of abortion as we've come to has turned our children into things more like widgets in a factory. But throwaway culture is at work in many, 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 many other examples besides abortion. The developed West has been slouching towards assisted suicide for decades, and I was sorry to see it newly legalized in Canada. But it has been around for some time in the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and even US states like Oregon and Washington. And I strongly agree with Pope Francis that assisted suicide is a classic example of throwaway culture as well. We are all quite sympathetic when it comes to people in physical pain. Of course, who would be something other than sympathetic? And that's why palliative care and hospice is just so important, and that we continue to work to make those opportunities better. But did you know that in Oregon, which has been studying this issue since the 90s, physical pain doesn't even make the top 5 reasons people request assisted suicide in Oregon? The number one fear is loss of autonomy. Also high on the list is fear of being a burden on others. But in a Christian ethic, along with a secular social justice ethic, which I think we need more cooperation between the two in our cultures, we are supposed to be focusing on sharing the burdens of others, even celebrating our opportunity to share in the burdens of others and lift them up. Perhaps my favorite article was my favorite bioethics article was written by a Protestant bioethicist named Gilbert Meilander, the title of which was, "I Want to be a Burden on My Family." Social justice activists already know in other areas how disabled, non-autonomous, burdensome human beings are unfairly treated and marginalized by a consumerist, ableist culture. But on the issue of assisted suicide, we seem content to use the language and logic of throwaway culture. It's no accident that disability rights groups are almost uniformly against assisted suicide. To them, it sends the message that lives like theirs are disposable. Yeah, we can kind of understand why you might want to kill yourself. Rather than work to create a culture in which autonomy and independence are not prerequisites for mattering, where burdens are shared and even celebrated, we instead diabolically work to make it easier for these marginalized populations to kill themselves. We would rather see them discarded than actually face the reality of what our culture is pushing them to do. This is especially odd as in other contexts, we are really trying to create an opposite kind of culture for other kinds of people who are despairing, right, and at risk of killing themselves. Think about, for instance, at least in our, maybe you have examples here in Canada that I don't know about, but in the United States you may have heard of the deaths by suicide of people like Robin Williams and Anthony Bourdain. That's led to a huge culture change in which we're trying to think, well, why are people so despairing? Why do they want to kill themselves? And we're trying to mitigate against that, but not on physician-assisted suicide, at least in most contexts. Many contexts, probably, is better to say. The critique of throwaway culture as a growing edge of the consistent life ethic does not fit neatly within secular conservative or secular liberal politics. One only needs to read Pope St. John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, his great letter on the gospel of life, to see that Catholic teaching applies our principles with regard to protection and support of life well beyond abortion and assisted suicide. Historically, many injustices have taken place precisely because we are beholden to a particular ideology which makes certain human beings invisible, especially when their dignity is most inconvenient. By following our principles more consistently across a range of issues, we can help mitigate against this injustice. It's probably better to say these injustices. In resisting throwaway culture, I am at pains to dismantle throwaway culture wherever I can find it, wherever you can find it, wherever anybody can find it. I don't care about political ideology. We need to just resist throwaway culture, period. As an example, on the other side, can we think about the Me Too moment, for instance? People with the kind of politics which leads them to miss the throwaway culture in abortion and euthanasia can see it quite clearly in how our sexual culture turns people into things that can be used and discarded, often with explicit violence, except that's sexual violence. And how about homelessness and mental health more generally? We can see the result of our throwaway culture with regard to most of our major and medium-sized cities, at least in the U.S. Many of these homeless, again, at least in the U.S., are veterans, people we sent to war to experience and perpetuate all kinds of terrible things. But their dignity is now quite inconvenient for us, especially if they are mentally ill and they are discarded as a kind of trash onto our streets. Happily, both right and left are beginning to see how throwaway culture functions when it comes to mass incarceration, which, as you may know, in the U.S., we bear the humiliating record for the highest rate of incarceration in the whole world. Instead of trying to focus on the root causes of crime, and especially drug addiction, we are simply happy to throw human beings away into our jails and prisons at ridiculously high rates, and even in some circumstances, make a profit off their slave labor. Have you heard about this? Private prisons contracting out literally slave labor to private companies. We are also happy to discard migrants claiming asylum protection from deadly violence, especially in the Northern Triangle, which is where the violence is just like mind-bogglingly bad. We dehumanize them by naming them as merely illegals or some such phrase produced by throwaway culture to hide their inherent human dignity. We have even been willing to separate children from their families, sometimes legally, but often explicitly as a means of trying to deter illegal immigration, using the anguish of children as a mere means to some other kind of end. This is another classic example of throwaway culture, using a vulnerable population as a mere means to an end, turning people into things. I also believe we need to examine how throwaway culture functions when it comes to the non-human world. Throwaway culture is very important as we think about the root causes of climate change, as we discard our trash and carbon emissions, often without a second thought for what this means for future generations. How we treat animals, too, is part of throwaway culture. It's interesting. We use one set of words or phrases when they are wanted as our pets, and another set of phrases when we want them as our food. And boy, it is difficult to imagine a more terrible example of throwing away than what we do to animals in big corporate factory farms. In fact, I was just talking with the high school students about this and how in Wisconsin, where I grew up, and here more and more big factory farms are taking over the small farms, which tend to treat the animals quite well. But the big factory farms are only really interested in maximizing, quote, protein units per square foot. We need more small farms. Animals are not protein units. Thinking that way is a classic example of throwaway culture. They're creatures which God created, and God created good, period, without any reference to human beings at all. Our job is to take care of them as the kinds of creatures God created them to be. That's what stewardship means. Now, the title behind me says Consistent Ethic of Life. What does any of this have to do with the pro-life movement? Well, I would ask you, have you met youngish pro-lifers? Millennials and iGen? Can we say iGen? I don't like Gen Z or whatever we're supposed to say. Like X, Y, Z, yeah, but it's iGen, right? Anyway, if you haven't, I really suggest you do. Young pro-lifers will blow up our 1998 stereotypes of what it means to be part of the pro-life movement, or perhaps better, pro-life movements. Especially among pro-lifers, I would argue, based on my experience, something like resisting culture already is quite at home, what it means to be pro-life. Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles recently noted that, quote, there are no single-issue saints, end quote. Frankly, even beyond the younger generation, I simply don't know any single-issue pro-lifers at all, period. Even those who might be tempted, we might be tempted to put in this camp, go well beyond abortion to euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, in vitro fertilization, human trafficking, adoption, foster care, and much, much more. They also love their families. They're outside the womb, right? A multi-issue approach, I believe, in a pro-life ethic actually conserves the origins of the pro-life movement, which actually began before Roe versus Wade, As the great historian Daniel K. Williams demonstrated in his remarkable book, which if you're interested at all in the history of the pro-life movement, you need to read this book, Defenders of the Unborn. The pro-life movement of that time, again, before Roe, was made up of very ideologically diverse people. As hard as it is for us to imagine today, large percentages were actually anti-war activists. Vietnam War was going on at the time. They even burned their birth certificates as tools of government oppression at pro-life rallies, in much the same way they burned their draft cards at anti-war rallies. Can you see the connection there? They saw the draft card as inherently unjust documents sending people to war without consent, and the birth certificate was this arbitrary document from the government saying you only matter after birth. They thought it was an unjust document. Rejecting a single issue approach, so based on this history, rejecting a single issue approach is not only more faithful to the gospel, it better conserves the pro-life movement, the history of the pro-life movement. And it's absolutely essential tool, I would argue, if we want to be evangelical or persuasive in the public sphere on pro-life issues. So many Americans and Canadians agree on so much of what the pro-life movement proposes, even on abortion morality and policy, and yet these very same people simply cannot see themselves as part of the movements, especially insofar as they see it being uniquely about abortion, which our opponents paint as being uniquely about misogyny and controlling women. I want to argue that consistently resisting throwaway culture, beyond being a requirement of faith and of reason, could put a diverse pro-life movement, diverse generationally, diverse racially, diverse politically, in a place to be a healing balm in our hyper-polarized left-right political discourse, and could actually make lots of converts to the pro-life movements. And now is the moment for something like this. As many fundamental political assumptions in the developed West of the last 2 generations are totally up for grabs. There's political movement all over the map in many, many places in the developed West. I'll talk more about that in a moment. First, my undergrad degree was in philosophy, and I can't help but deal with counter-arguments. So I want to address I try to get in the head of my opponents as much as I can, or at least my perceived opponents, and try to address skepticism. So let me do that in 2 ways. Let me address the skeptical response I've heard that comes, well, from 2 different places. The very binary political divide I'm attempting to resist. The first one comes from more traditional or conservative pro-lifers, for whom the term consistent pro-life ethic might raise eyebrows. For them, it is problematic that anything should take away from the church's unique focus on abortion. The second comes from more progressive, mostly secular folks who really don't believe that especially Roman Catholic pro-life movement could really be interested in multiple issues. Isn't it really only interested with, abortion and other pelvic issues, wanting to control women? But let's go to the tape, as it were, and look at what the major players in Catholic pro-life world have to say about that. I told you we come back to Pope St. John Paul II's great encyclical Evangelium Vitae. It surprised no one that a pope writing on the gospel of life would have particular focuses on abortion and euthanasia, but it may have been surprising to some that his pro-life ethic went beyond those classic issues in consistently calling out a number of different but interrelated issues which transcended the conservative liberal binary, including poverty and the death penalty and war. Pope Benedict XVI's work in this area reflected the views of his predecessor. In his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, for instance, Benedict explicitly says that the distinction between pro-life issues, where the church is thought to have more conservative views, and social justice issues, where the church is thought more to have more liberal views, is false. Abortion, euthanasia, embryo-destructive research are to be understood as social justice issues, just as global consumerism, ecological concern, and care for the poor are to be understood as life issues. Life issues are social justice issues, and social justice issues are life issues, at least according to Benedict. And he was especially strong in showing how ecological issues were related to life issues. So strong, in fact, that you may remember he earned the moniker the Green Pope. If I tell young people today, who is the Green Pope, they almost always say Francis, right? Benedict was the Green Pope. But I did focus my book on Pope Francis's work. The phrase, again, throwaway culture, comes from Francis, or at least has been made famous by Francis. And he is known for his takes on issues of the left, ecological concern, care for migrants and refugees, and the poor. But he's had some striking things to say about abortion and euthanasia as well. Those have not been covered as much by US media, I suspect not as much by Canadian media as well. In fact, he called so-called therapeutic abortion, when the child is deemed, again, too disabled to live, he called it a white-glove Nazi crime. A white-glove Nazi crime? Yeah, that's Pope Francis. I don't think JP2 or Benedict said anything remotely that harsh about abortion ever. So one simply looks at what the Catholic Church teaches, and it becomes clear that some version of the consistent life ethic is just authoritative for faithful Catholics. And I happen to think that Pope Francis gets it right by framing the connections between the issues as consistently resisting throwaway culture as the best way to kind of have a lens into all this stuff. That's why I wrote the book I did. But here's another skeptical question that I imagine some of you have in mind. How could anything like what I'm laying out here work in the current political environment? In both Canada and the United States, our politics make something like what I'm proposing here seem pretty close to impossible, doesn't it? Almost like, well, how would this even happen? How would this work? And I get this concern. Boy, do I get it. But let me say a few things in response to this concern. First, it should be clear, as Christians, we owe our ultimate loyalty to Christ and to Christ's church, not a secular political party, right? To the extent that we fit easily within secular politics, I would argue the danger of idolatry looms, making an idol out of secular politics. We should not expect to fit into right or left categories or any secular political categories. We are a pilgrim people on a journey. We should not expect to be anything other than politically homeless. Second, though we go on and on about political polarization, which makes what I'm proposing sound pretty difficult, and it is a major problem to be sure, U.S. Americans and increasingly around the world, we are refusing to accept our lazy and incoherent liberal-conservative binary. I'm going to give some examples from the United States, but I'm eager to hear if this rings true for you in Canada as well. Just 10 years ago, 34% of Americans identified as independents, that is, not Democrats, not Republicans. That's still a pretty high number. That's over 1 in 3. Today, that number is 44%. The highest in the 75 years that Pew was tracking this number. Pew poll was tracking this number. By contrast, the poll found only 27% identify as Democrats and 26% as Republicans. A major 2018 study of political affiliation in the United States, which was titled Hidden Tribes, found something very similar. As the New York Times, which covered hidden tribes, put it, the study found that most people, quote, do not see their lives through a political lens, and when they have political views, the views are far less rigid than those of the highly politically engaged, ideologically orthodox tribes, end quote. Indeed, the study found that 2/3 of U.S. Americans belong to what the study described as a, quote, exhausted majority. Anybody here part of the exhausted majority? Their members, quote, share a sense of fatigue with our polarized national conversation, a willingness to be flexible in their political viewpoints, and a lack of a voice in the national conversation, end quote. That's 2/3. I suspect if you drill down into what Canadians actually believe, something similar is true of the electorate in this country as well, but please correct me if you think I'm wrong about that. Again, if we focus on the complex place where most people are, we may be able to do away with the hopelessly simplistic right-left, liberal-conservative, two-dimensional model. Realignment forces may have well been set in motion, which will lead the whole model to come crashing down. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson put the matter bluntly. He said, quote, my view is that the traditional right to left, progressive to conservative, Democrat to Republican political axis that we're all so familiar with is no longer a valid schematic of American political opinion. And I believe neither party has the foggiest idea of what the new diagram looks like, end quote. And it may be young people which pushes the old coalitions to their final collapse. Consider these 4 facts about millennials. 1 in 2 choose to identify as something other than Democrat or Republican. They are fiercely committed to service and social change. They don't see politics or government as a primary way of positively affecting social change. And 71% see the need for a major new party. As Michael Steele, former head of the Republican National Committee, put it, young people are, quote, going to destroy the old silos, scatter their elements to the wind, and reassemble them in ways that make sense for them and their new era, end quote. The script for creating the replacement political culture has yet to be written. Some worry that our radical moral diversity will leave us so hopelessly fragmented that such common script writing is impossible. And some days, on my darkest days, I kind of agree, but I'm not feeling that way now. And indeed, if we plow ahead in this moment too quickly, if we skip ahead to political sloganeering and 10-point plans and those gimmicks, we're going to miss a very rare and important opportunity to do something more lasting and more significant, I think. Here at this moment of political and social uncertainty lies a golden opportunity to slow down and catch our breath. I guess it would be after Monday. To resist our political anxieties and tend to our deep spiritual wounds. What ails us as a culture at bottom has very little to do with politics or policy. As important as these concerns are, the root problem goes deeper to our foundational understandings of the good. Jonah Goldberg recently wrote that, quote, politics cannot fill the holes in our souls, end quote. A hyper-focus on politics and policy keeps us frothy and anxious at a surface level in ways that distract us and even prohibit us from having the kinds of foundational introspection this cultural moment provides us. In my book, I've suggested that maybe the most important thing we can do in the short term is take a deep, cleansing political shower. Scrub all away the dirt and grime that has built up over years or even decades. Put salve on our neglected wounds and burns. Step away from the anxieties of news and election cycles. Clear our minds, unburden our hearts, and instead focus on our fundamental questions. What is it we value most in life? What grounds those values? What do those values mean for how we actually live together with our neighbors? This engagement with our neighbors is at the heart of what Pope Francis calls the culture of encounter, which he calls the antidote to throwaway culture. But this is a very, very difficult thing to do when so many powerful forces, including social media, maybe especially social media, are pushing us to disconnect from genuine encounters with others, thus leading to what some are calling a public health crisis of loneliness. Have you heard about what's going on in the U.S. with deaths of despair? Deaths of despair have led to U.S. life expectancy going down for 3 straight years. Richest country in the world, in the history of the world. Life expectancy down 3 straight years in a row. First time that's ever happened since World War I. We, at least, are a disconnected, lonely, anxious, stressed, despairing, and depressed people, a people which is literally killing ourselves. I hope it goes without saying, please don't follow us down this path. Many U.S. Americans have tried to distract themselves from all of this by focusing on national politics. As one Atlantic headline put it, national politics has taken over America. But engaging politics from a place of loneliness and despair often leads to precisely the kind of angry, polarized, hate-driven politics that we just talked about, and it creates a vicious cycle. After the 2018 midterm election, political commentators suggested that the U.S. is in the midst of a, quote, cold civil war, end quote. One West Virginia voter quoted on Election Day morning 2018 had a poignant quote. I thought I'd quote her for you. She said, "I'm so upset I just feel physically ill, just the ugliness of it all. It's so heartbreaking that all we can do is bring each other down and cut into each other. I feel like I'm going to cry." Politics not only cannot fill the hole in our souls, it is currently making the hole that much bigger. As the head of Communion and Liberation Movement likes to say, if you don't think Pope Francis is the cure, you don't grasp the disease. In Laudato Si number 128, Francis decries the idea that political efforts or the force of law will be sufficient for creating an authentic, robust, life-giving example of social change. On the contrary, the Holy Father is primarily concerned about the need to create a culture of encounter and hospitality, precisely the kind of counterculture needed to address what is killing us. Francis calls us to, quote, face-to-face encounters with others, with their physical presence which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy which infects us in our close and continuous interaction, end quote. And discussion of this point is where I'd like to end my remarks tonight. I respect those who look around at our individualistic, autonomy-obsessed secular politics and say, we got to do something different. We need wholesale changes. But to be clear, I'm not a Benedict option guy, if you know what that means, who believes we ought to retreat and form communities explicitly disconnected from national political concerns and have that be where we stand for the reasonably foreseen future. I do respect those who are drawn to the Benedict option, however, because I think they have an important insight. I think many of us could benefit not from withdrawal, but from a temporary strategic retreat from national politics and focus more on living out and strengthening a culture of encounter in our own lives and in our local communities. Maybe here in Regina you don't need it as much. I was struck by how much the culture of encounter is alive and well, but I'm just thinking about that now. Such encounters, especially with people who don't think like we do, can force us to take a harder look at ourselves and see how our views and actions might be actually contributing to the intersecting forces which create and sustain throwaway culture. We could live in this space where we can be transformed by such encounters for several months or years. You can discern it, right, with prayer and listening to God working in your life. We could use the time not only to allow the change to take place, but reflect on the new person we are becoming. And I hope this isn't, I don't know, is it possible to talk about daydreaming about that sort of thing? A practice that's increasingly rare in the age of this. Daydreaming about ways we might approach the public thing, new and creative ways to approach the public thing. And I'm implicated in the following things, but I'll just say them anyway. Taking walks, subway, and train rides without earbuds, or car rides without the radio or Bluetooth in the background. Volunteering in prisons, nursing homes, detention centers, and other places where we house those who are thrown away. Meditate, pray, go to confession, adore the Blessed Sacrament. Be still in the certainty that God is doing something new in us. So how can we pull politics back from the brink? How can we heal a fractured, throwaway culture? It won't be by doing more of the same. I've argued that something like a culture of encounter, transforming our politics into a politics of encounter, is one of the few things I can see doing that. But I urge you to come to your own conclusions and again, listen to God speaking to you and how God is working in your life. For what it's worth, I'll just say in conclusion a few very brief words about how it's worked for me, how this process has worked for me. After a period of deep reflection, I recently resigned from the board of Democrats for Life and registered as a member of the American Solidarity Party. Probably you don't know what that is. It's a very small but exciting and growing party that is designed to reflect Catholic social teaching in its entirety. That's American Solidarity Party. They are a small but growing party, as I said, and it's trying to serve this group of people that we found through some research inhabit the upper left quadrant of a graph where the x-axis measures right and left on social issues, and the vertical axis measures right and left on economic issues. There's this upper left quadrant, for you it would be up here, on a graph where people are conservative, to use a phrase that's not very precise, on social issues, and liberal on economic issues. In the United States, there are tens of millions of people in that upper left quadrant. They have no party. I suspect there's no party for them in Canada either. For what it's worth, I've decided to play the long game and work toward helping a party which can serve the ULQs. I don't know if that's the best name for it. ULQs, upper left quadrants. You may come to a different conclusion, But let me suggest that it will be extremely difficult to come to an authentic conclusion unless we retreat again from the froth and angst of national secular politics and instead work to put ourselves in places to be personally transformed profoundly by genuine encounters with God and neighbor. At least if you're like me, only then will you be fortified to resist our powerful throwaway culture and resist it with a politics grounded in a culture of encounter and hospitality with and for the other. Thank you very much.